They would call it the birth of freedom, but most colonists would remember it by the friends who stopped speaking to them along the way. Before independence, before the Constitution, before the Republic that justified everything, there was the waiting. Decades of it. Tonight, we return to Boston Harbor, autumn of 1763, when ordinary subjects of the British Crown discovered that victory in war could feel surprisingly like defeat in peace. Morning breaks over the colonial ports where merchant ships unload cargo that now carries the weight of new imperial policies. Customs officials check manifests with fresh authority. Store owners calculate profits that seem to shrink with each regulation. Across the counting houses, families make daily calculations, fathers reviewing ledgers one more time, mothers stretching household budgets that no longer stretch as far, children learning that familiar purchases now require careful consideration. In that narrow space between loyalty and resistance, you stand behind a shop counter with everything you've built depending on policies made by people who've never seen your neighborhood. This is not a story of dramatic battles or stirring speeches. It's the slow work of ordinary people discovering they possessed opinions about government they never knew they had, merchants writing careful letters, neighbors holding evening conversations that somehow became political education, and patience measured in decades rather than moments. Welcome to American Sleepless Story, where forgotten moments from America's past become tonight's gentle companion. These are quiet stories told slowly, perfect for when your mind needs to wander somewhere peaceful. If you'd like more stories like this, hit subscribe. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? I love knowing this community spans different places and time zones, all finding rest in the same American stories. Now, settle in, here comes the story. The old brass clock on the wall of Hartwell's general store chimed 6 times, its familiar melody drifting through the sleepless streets of colonial Boston like a gentle reminder that some things remained constant in 1765. The sound had marked the hours for 3 generations of merchants, its steady rhythm becoming as much a part of the American story as the worn wooden floors beneath countless feet. Samuel Hartwell paused in his morning inventory, listening to that boring, beautiful consistency that somehow made even the most mundane tasks feel connected to something larger than the day's simple transactions. The morning light filtered through windows that bore the subtle film of harbor salt, casting everything in that particular golden haze that made colonial mornings feel both sleepy and alive. Hartwell's fingers moved across bolts of cloth with practiced ease, each texture telling its own quiet story of trade routes and distant looms. The coarse wool from Yorkshire felt different now, not in quality, but in the weight of knowledge that every yard carried new duties that transformed simple commerce into something resembling careful negotiation with invisible authorities who seemed to sleep fitfully in London offices. Behind the counter, the store's account ledger lay open like a patient witness to the gradual transformation of American business. Its leather binding had absorbed years of conversations, calculations, and the particular stress that comes from watching familiar routines become complicated procedures. The pages themselves seemed to breathe with the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions: which suppliers to trust, which customers deserved credit, and increasingly, which regulations required attention before a merchant could simply focus on the boring business of selling goods to people who needed them. The Sugar Act had introduced a new vocabulary to colonial life, words that interrupted the sleepy rhythm of traditional commerce like pebbles thrown into still water. Molasses, once simply an ingredient for rum or sweetening, now carried the weight of official scrutiny. Every barrel required documentation that transformed storage rooms into filing systems and transformed merchants into reluctant bureaucrats who spent as much time with papers as with products. The American dream of straightforward commerce was developing complications that felt both personal and political. Mrs. Henderson arrived for her weekly provisions, her familiar routine now punctuated by questions about prices that seemed to change without warning. She fingered the bolt of blue cotton with the same care her grandmother had shown, but her eyes carried the new wariness of someone learning to calculate not just cost, but the hidden expenses of imperial policy. Their conversation unfolded with the comfortable rhythm of neighbors who had conducted business together for years. Yet underneath lay the shared understanding that even the most boring transactions now carried implications that extended far beyond the simple exchange of goods for money. The afternoon brought visits from other merchants, men whose faces had acquired the particular expression of people constantly solving problems they hadn't created. They gathered around Hartwell's counter like students studying a lesson none of them had signed up for, comparing notes about enforcement policies that seemed to vary with each customs official's interpretation. The store became an informal classroom where successful American businessmen learned to navigate regulations designed by people who had never spent a sleepless night wondering whether a shipment would clear customs without unexpected delays or additional fees. The Stamp Act transformed even the humblest business activities into exercises in official compliance, as if the simple act of selling thread or candles required government approval at every step. Hartwell found himself maintaining multiple sets of records, one for his own understanding of profits and losses, another for potential inspection by authorities whose arrival could transform a routine day into a formal examination. The oak desk that had served his father now supported documents that previous generations of merchants never could have imagined, papers that documented the gradual transformation of colonial commerce from art to science. Evening inventory revealed the true cost of conducting business under policies designed to strengthen imperial control while somehow generating colonial prosperity. Every item on the shelves carried not just its purchase price and hoped for profit, but the accumulated weight of duties, documentation requirements, and the particular stress that comes from conducting straightforward business in an increasingly complicated regulatory environment. The American story was developing chapters that earlier generations had never had to read, much less memorize. The brass clock chimed 9 times as Hartwell prepared to close his store, its boring, reliable voice echoing through streets where other merchants were conducting similar end-of-day rituals. The sound carried the same comfort it always had, but now it marked time in a world where colonial businessmen found themselves caught between the familiar rhythms of local commerce and the increasingly complex demands of imperial administration. The store's windows reflected lamplight that fell across account books documenting a society learning to balance prosperity with compliance. As he locked the door and listened to his footsteps echo cobblestones worn smooth by decades of colonial life, Hartwell carried with him the accumulated weight of a day spent navigating policies that seemed designed by people who had never stood behind a counter watching customers count coins while calculating whether familiar purchases remained affordable. The brass clock would continue its reliable chiming through the sleepless hours ahead, marking time in an American story that was slowly learning to distinguish between the rhythms of commerce and the demands of empire. The brass clock in Samuel Adams's modest Boston home chimed softly through the early morning hours, its gentle voice accompanying the scratch of quill against parchment. America's most patient revolutionary crafted another letter to distant committees. The sleepless quality of his correspondence work had become legendary among those who understood that boring, methodical organization could prove more powerful than the most passionate speeches. Adams had discovered that revolution wasn't built in moments of dramatic inspiration, but in the accumulated weight of countless small actions, each as predictable and persistent as the clock's reliable chiming. His study bore witness to the particular genius of a man who understood that successful resistance required both secrecy and publicity, both underground coordination and public spectacle. The same oak desk that held family ledgers now supported maps marking every colonial port where committees of correspondence had taken root, their invisible network carrying ideas faster than any royal messenger could travel. The American story was learning to write itself through channels that bypassed official authority, creating connections that felt both revolutionary and remarkably ordinary, like neighbors sharing news over garden fences. Adams's morning routine included reading reports from dozens of correspondents whose letters arrived with the same reliability as merchant vessels returning from familiar trade routes. Each envelope contained not just information, but evidence that colonial resistance had developed its own boring, beautiful consistency. A tax protest in Charleston, a customs dispute in Philadelphia, a town meeting resolution in Providence individually, these events seemed minor. But Adams understood how separate grievances could weave together into something resembling continental consciousness. The correspondence itself reflected Adams's particular talent for transforming local complaints into universal principles, taking the specific frustrations of Boston merchants and presenting them as violations of rights that belonged to every colonial American. His letters read like gentle conversations between reasonable neighbors, yet carried ideas that challenged fundamental assumptions about imperial authority. The sleepless hours he spent crafting this correspondence created an invisible university where colonists learned to think continentally while acting locally. George Washington's own transformation from Virginia planner to continental commander began not with dramatic gestures, but with the same kind of methodical attention to detail that characterized successful farming. His Mount Vernon estate had taught him lessons about managing resources, coordinating labor, and maintaining morale through difficult season skills that proved remarkably applicable to commanding an amateur army facing professional opponents. The American story was discovering that effective leadership often grew from the most boring, practical experience rather than from abstract theories about military science. Washington's correspondence with Adams revealed to different temperaments united by shared understanding that colonial resistance required both inspiration and administration, both visionary goals and practical methods for achieving them. Their letters crossed paths like ships, following established trade routes, carrying ideas between Virginia plantations and Massachusetts towns, creating connections that bridged regional differences through shared commitment to principles that felt both revolutionary and fundamentally conservative. They sought not to destroy familiar institutions, but to preserve them against policies that threatened colonial autonomy. The brass clock that marked Adams's working hours also witnessed the gradual development of networks that connected every major colonial port through invisible threads of communication and coordination. Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, John Jay in New York, Christopher Gadsden in Charleston, each man contributed his particular talents to a resistance movement that succeeded precisely because it avoided the dramatic gestures that might have attracted unwanted attention. The boring work of writing letters, organizing meetings, and maintaining correspondence created infrastructure for revolution that imperial authorities never quite managed to understand or interrupt. Adams's genius lay in understanding that effective organization required both patience and persistence, qualities that most people associated with mundane activities rather than political transformation. His Sons of Liberty succeeded not through spectacular confrontations, but through the sleepless attention to detail that ensured every protest appeared spontaneous while following carefully coordinated plans. The American story was learning that revolution could grow from the same patient, methodical work that characterized successful commerce or farming. The evening hours found Adams still at his desk, reviewing reports and planning activities with the same careful attention his merchant neighbors devoted to inventory management. His revolution was being built one letter at a time, one committee meeting at a time, one small act of resistance at a time. The brass clock chimed through these quiet hours of preparation, marking time in a process that would eventually transform 13 separate colonial societies into something unprecedented and human. History, a continental republic founded on principles that grew from the most boring, practical work of democratic organization. As lamplight flickered across pages covered with neat handwriting that documented the gradual emergence of American political consciousness, Adams embodied the particular genius of a revolution that succeeded precisely because it learned to combine visionary ideals with the kind of practical, persistent work that characterized the most successful colonial enterprises. The brass clock would continue its reliable marking of time through sleepless hours ahead, witnessing the boring, beautiful process by which ordinary colonial subjects gradually transformed themselves into American citizens. The old brass clock in Widow Patterson's parlor had witnessed countless evening gatherings where neighbors discussed the peculiar changes creeping through colonial minds like morning fog rolling across Boston Harbor. These sleepless conversations, punctuated by the gentle ticking that marked time in an increasingly uncertain American story, revealed how ordinary people gradually discovered they were thinking thoughts their parents never could have imagined. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, it was as boring and persistent as the clock's reliable rhythm, yet somehow more profound than any single moment of revelation. Mrs. Patterson herself embodied this mysterious shift in colonial consciousness, her careful hands serving tea while her mind wrestled with ideas that would have seemed foreign just a few years earlier. She had always been a loyal subject of the crown, dutifully observing royal birthdays and teaching her children proper respect for established authority. Yet lately, she found herself questioning policies that felt increasingly disconnected from the practical realities of colonial life. The sleepless hours she spent wondering whether obedience to distant laws served local needs reflected a transformation occurring in parlors throughout the 13 colonies. The evening discussions that gathered around her tea table included merchants like Samuel Hartwell, whose daily struggles with imperial regulations provided concrete examples of how abstract policies affected real families. These conversations possessed the boring, repetitive quality of people trying to solve problems they hadn't created, yet beneath the surface ran currents of thought that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between government and governed. The American story was learning to distinguish between loyalty to principles and submission to particular policies, a distinction that previous generations had rarely needed to consider. Young Timothy Morrison, whose father counted coins in the general store, listened to these adult conversations with the intense attention of someone discovering that the world contained possibilities his childhood had never suggested. The sleepless curiosity that kept him awake after these gatherings reflected the particular excitement of realizing that ordinary people could question extraordinary claims to authority. His questions simple, boring inquiries about why distant officials should determine local policies carried implications that reached far beyond his mother's parlor discussions. The transformation of colonial thinking revealed itself most clearly in the way familiar words began carrying new meanings, as if the English language itself was developing an American accent. Liberty evolved from an abstract legal concept into something personal and practical, connected to specific grievances about specific policies affecting specific communities. Rights became less about inherited privileges and more about fundamental protections that belonged to human beings regardless of their geographic location or political allegiance. The brass clock witnessed conversations where colonial Americans gradually discovered their own vocabulary for describing experiences that imperial terminology couldn't quite capture. Church services provided another venue where colonial consciousness quietly transformed itself. As ministers whose sermons had traditionally emphasized obedience to earthly authority began exploring biblical passages about higher laws that sometimes conflicted with human commands. These boring theological discussions, conducted in the same measured tones that characterized prayer and psalm singing, nevertheless planted seeds of thought that grew into political principles. The American story was discovering that spiritual independence often preceded political independence, creating intellectual foundations for resistance that felt both revolutionary and deeply traditional. The mystery of this mental transformation lay partly in its gradual, almost unconscious character. People discovered they had changed their minds without remembering exactly when or how the change occurred. Conversations that began with complaints about specific policies gradually evolved into discussions of fundamental principles, as if colonial Americans were teaching themselves political philosophy through the practical experience of living under policies that increasingly felt foreign. The sleepless quality of these discussions reflected minds working through ideas that had no clear precedent in their inherited political traditions. Women like Mrs. Patterson found themselves thinking thoughts that challenged not just imperial policies, but traditional assumptions about who possessed the authority to think such thoughts. The boring domesticity of serving tea and maintaining households somehow became venues for political education that prepared colonial Americans for responsibilities they were only beginning to imagine. Their conversations created informal networks of resistance that operated through the same social channels that had always carried gossip and community news, transforming familiar interactions into vehicles for revolutionary ideas. The brass clock that marked these evening discussions also witnessed the emergence of a distinctly American way of thinking about political problems practical, skeptical of abstract authority, focused on concrete results rather than theoretical elegance. Colonial Americans were developing intellectual habits that combined respect for traditional wisdom with willingness to question particular applications of that wisdom. The sleepless hours they spent wrestling with these ideas created mental frameworks that would eventually support institutions unprecedented in human history. As lamplight flickered across faces engaged in conversations that seemed boring yet somehow momentous, the mystery of colonial transformation revealed itself as something both simple and profound. Ordinary people discovering that they possessed the mental equipment necessary for self-governance. The brass clock continued its reliable marking of time through these quiet hours of intellectual revolution, witnessing the boring, beautiful process by which colonial subjects gradually learned to think like American citizens, one conversation at a time. The brass clock in Colonel Harrison's study had chimed through countless dinners where Virginia's plantation elite gathered to discuss matters that seemed far removed from the sleepless nights of Boston merchants or on the boring evening conversations in Widow Patterson's parlor. Yet by 1775, even these elegant dining rooms couldn't escape the American story that was reshaping colonial society from the humble counting house to the most refined drawing rooms. The war had arrived not just as distant news, but as a personal crisis that forced every prominent family to choose between inherited loyalties and emerging principles. Harrison himself embodied the particular dilemma facing colonial elites whose prosperity depended on imperial connections, yet whose local influence required maintaining respect among neighbors increasingly committed to resistance. His mahogany dining table, imported from London workshops and polished to mirror perfection, now hosted conversations about whether supporting American independence meant betraying the very imperial system that had created opportunities for colonial advancement. The sleepless quality of these discussions reflected minds trained for leadership discovering that familiar categories of loyalty and rebellion no longer provided clear guidance. The evening gatherings in plantation houses throughout Virginia revealed how the war had transformed social relationships that previous generations had taken for granted. Families whose names appeared on the most prestigious guest lists found themselves divided by political principles that cut across traditional lines of wealth, education, and social standing. Brothers argued across dinner tables that had witnessed decades of polite conversation, their disputes reflecting broader tensions between personal relationships and political commitments that seemed to demand choosing sides in ways that felt both necessary and tragic. Mrs. Randolph, whose family connections extended to the highest levels of Virginia society, found herself navigating conversations where lifelong friends had become political opponents without anyone quite understanding how the transformation had occurred. The boring formalities of social calling and dinner parties continued, but underneath lay currents of suspicion and calculation that made even the most innocent remarks about weather or crops carry potential political implications. The American story was learning that revolution affected drawing rooms as well as meeting houses, transforming social rituals that had once provided refuge from political controversy. The war created particular challenges for families whose sons served in different armies, their divided loyalties reflecting broader uncertainties about whether American independence served the long-term interests of colonial elites. Colonel Harrison's own nephew had accepted a commission with British forces, while his youngest son drilled with the local militia, their opposing commitments transforming family gatherings into exercises in careful diplomacy. The brass clock witnessed conversations where parents tried to maintain family harmony while their children embodied irreconcilable political differences. Plantation managers discovered that the war had complicated every aspect of agricultural planning, from labor management to crop selection to transportation arrangements. The sleepless hours they spent calculating whether cotton or tobacco would find markets in a world disrupted by naval warfare reflected practical concerns that extended far beyond political theory. The American story was forcing colonial elites to consider whether their prosperity could survive the independence their neighbors increasingly demanded, or whether accommodation with imperial authority offered better protection for interests that transcended local political enthusiasm. The evening discussions in Harrison's study included merchants whose London connections provided valuable intelligence about imperial policy, lawyers whose legal training helped interpret the constitutional questions that divided Americans and British, and planners whose agricultural expertise contributed practical knowledge about economic independence. These boring, methodical conversations about logistics and supply chains proved as important as any military strategy, since the war's outcome might ultimately depend on whether American agriculture could sustain prolonged conflict with the world's most powerful empire. Women of prominent families found themselves managing estates and businesses while their husbands served in military or political roles. Their competent administration challenging traditional assumptions about feminine capabilities while demonstrating that colonial society possessed hidden reserves of leadership talent. The brass clock marked hours when Mrs. Harrison reviewed account books and corresponded with overseers, her careful attention to detail supporting a war effort that depended as much on domestic management as battlefield courage. The transformation of colonial elite society revealed itself most clearly in the gradual emergence of American social institutions that operated independently of imperial approval or oversight. Local academies, libraries, and cultural societies that had once sought London recognition now focused on serving specifically American needs. The sleepless energy that went into creating these institutions reflected confidence that colonial society could develop its own standards of excellence without reference to metropolitan opinion. As the brass clock chimed through another evening of careful conversation among people whose decisions would help determine whether the American experiment succeeded or failed, the war's impact on colonial elite society demonstrated that revolution required not just popular enthusiasm, but sophisticated leadership capable of transforming political ideals into practical institutions. The boring work of administration and organization that characterized these plantation discussions proved as essential to American independence and any military victory, creating foundations for a society that could govern itself with dignity and effectiveness. The brass clock in Independence Hall had witnessed the sleepless summer of 1787, when delegates from 12 states gathered to address problems that threatened to dissolve the American experiment before it truly began. The same room where independence had been declared 11 years earlier now hosted conversations about whether the ideals proclaimed in that revolutionary moment could survive the boring, practical challenges of actually governing a continental republic. The discussions that unfolded around the mahogany tables reflected hard-earned wisdom about the difference between winning independence and creating institutions worthy of the sacrifices that victory had required. James Madison arrived in Philadelphia carrying trunks filled with books about confederations, republics, and federations, his sleepless months of preparation reflecting understanding that successful government required more than good intentions or patriotic enthusiasm. The American story had reached its most critical chapter, transforming military victory into constitutional government that could preserve liberty while maintaining order. His careful notes, written in the same methodical handwriting that had characterized Samuel Adams's correspondence, documented discussions where theoretical knowledge met practical experience in ways that previous political philosophers had never attempted. The summer debates revealed how victory over British forces had created new challenges that military success alone couldn't resolve. States pursued conflicting policies that threatened to fragment the Confederation into separate regional governments, their disputes over trade, currency, and territorial boundaries demonstrating that local interests didn't automatically align with continental needs. The brass clock marked hours when delegates wrestled with questions about how much authority federal government required to function effectively and how much autonomy individual states could retain without undermining collective security. General Washington's presence provided crucial moral authority for discussions that often seemed to generate more heat than light. His patient chairmanship reflecting lessons learned through 8 years of managing competing egos and regional prejudices within the Continental Army. The sleepless hours he had spent maintaining military unity now informed efforts to create political institutions that could survive the kind of factional disputes that had nearly destroyed the war effort on multiple occasions. His willingness to support stronger federal government carried weight precisely because his wartime service had demonstrated both his competence and his commitment to Republican principles. The Connecticut Compromise that resolved deadlock between large and small states reflected the kind of boring, practical negotiation that characterized successful business partnerships throughout colonial America. Delegates discovered that effective government required the same patient attention to competing interests that merchants used when negotiating contracts or planners used when coordinating crop rotations. The American story was learning that constitutional government succeeded through careful balancing of different needs rather than through dramatic gestures or theoretical purity. Alexander Hamilton's advocacy for energetic federal government drew on his experience managing military logistics during the war, when weak continental authority had nearly cost American forces their ability to maintain armies in the field. His correspondence with merchants like Samuel Hartwell had taught him that commerce required predictable legal frameworks that individual states couldn't provide independently. The brass clock witnessed discussions where theoretical arguments about governmental power met practical evidence about what worked and what failed when people tried to conduct business or maintain security across state boundaries. The ratification debates that followed revealed how thoroughly the American political conversation had matured since the early days of resistance to imperial policies. Anti-Federalists raised sophisticated objections that forced supporters of the Constitution to develop equally sophisticated responses, their exchanges demonstrating that colonial Americans had learned to think constitutionally with remarkable sophistication. The sleepless hours that both sides devoted to crafting arguments reflected understanding that ideas had consequences and that careless political choices could destroy everything that 8 years of warfare had accomplished. The Bill of Rights that emerged from ratification discussions represented the culmination of political education that had begun in places like Widow Patterson's parlor, where ordinary colonists had first learned to distinguish between legitimate authority and arbitrary power. The boring legal language that protected freedom of speech, religion, and assembly grew from practical experience with policies that had violated those freedoms in ways that seemed both personal and political. The American story had discovered that successful government required explicit protection for the rights that made self-governance possible. George Washington's inaugural address as the first president under the new Constitution completed a transformation that had begun with his acceptance of military command 12 years earlier. The brass clock that had marked the hours of constitutional convention now witnessed the peaceful transfer of power from military to civilian authority, demonstrating that American Republicans could create institutions that functioned according to law rather than personal loyalty or traditional hierarchy. As evening fell over a nation that existed not just in declaration, but in constitutional reality, the brass clock continued its reliable marking of time through the sleepless hours. When ordinary Americans gradually learned to think of themselves as citizens of a republic founded on principles that most of the world considered impossible, the boring work of administration and legislation that lay ahead would test whether revolutionary ideals could survive the practical challenges of governing real people in real communities. But the constitutional framework created during that summer in Philadelphia provided tools for peaceful change that distinguished the American experiment from every previous attempt at Republican government. And so, we find ourselves at the end of this sleepless journey through America's quietest revolution, where the brass clock that marks Samuel Hartwell's morning inventory in 1765 somehow connects to the Constitutional Conventions of 1787. The same patient, boring attention to detail that characterized colonial merchants calculating profits under new imperial policies eventually grew into the methodical work of creating a government that could balance liberty with order, individual rights with collective needs. Tonight, you've witnessed how ordinary people merchants worried about customs duties, neighbors gathering for evening conversations, plantation owners wrestling with divided loyalties gradually discovered they possessed the mental equipment necessary for self-governance. The American story revealed itself not through dramatic moments that changed everything instantly, but through the accumulated weight of countless small decisions made by people who learned to think continentally while living locally. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this revolution was its fundamentally boring character, the patient correspondence networks, the methodical organization of committees, the careful attention to constitutional details that most people would find tedious. Samuel Adams spent sleepless hours writing letters that traveled at the speed of sailing ships. James Madison filled trunks with books about political theory that most people would never read. George Washington devoted years to the unglamorous work of military administration that rarely makes it into exciting historical narratives. Yet from this foundation of practical, persistent work emerged principles that continue to influence how people around the world think about government, liberty, and human dignity. The brass clock that witnessed colonial transformation keeps ticking in our modern world, where we still wrestle with questions about how much authority governments should exercise, how individual rights relate to collective security, and whether ordinary people really can govern themselves without destroying either freedom or order. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider how the revolution's greatest victory wasn't military or political, but educational. It taught people that they could create new institutions based on consent rather than tradition, that they could preserve liberty while maintaining civilization, and that the boring work of democratic participation was actually the most important activity in which human beings could engage. The sleepless hours that colonial Americans spent learning to think like citizens created foundations for peaceful change that distinguished their experiment from every previous attempt at Republican government. Their patient, methodical approach to political transformation offers lessons for our own time, when rapid change often seems to create more problems than it solves. Sweet dreams, and remember that sometimes the most important revolutions happen not through dramatic gestures, but through the quiet, persistent work of ordinary people making extraordinary choices about human freedom. If you found peace in this gentle journey through America's founding story, maybe you'd enjoy exploring other decades where change happened slowly enough for people to actually understand what they were creating. What period of American history would you most like to visit in your dreams? The sleepy decades of westward expansion, the boring brilliance of early industrial development, or perhaps the quiet moments between more famous events, when ordinary people were simply living their lives while history unfolded around them. If tonight's story helped you find that peaceful place between wakefulness and sleep, consider subscribing to continue these journeys together. Hit that notification bell if you'd like gentle reminders when new episodes arrive, because sometimes the best stories are the ones that help us remember why rest matters as much as action, and why understanding the past can make the present feel a little more manageable. And if you're still awake after all this beautifully boring historical detail, drop a comment about which era or decade you'd most like to explore next. Our community of fellow insomniacs loves sharing suggestions for future sleepless adventures through America's quieter moments. Until next time, sleep well knowing that the revolution's greatest gift wasn't just political independence, but the discovery that ordinary people possess extraordinary capacity for thoughtful self-governance. One patient, boring decision at a time.